February 1945. Northern Germany had become a frozen graveyard where temperatures dropped to -25 degrees Celsius. In this hell on earth, over 200 civilians froze to death every single week, while Allied soldiers followed orders and watched from their positions. The official policy was crystal clear. Do not engage with German civilians. Do not abandon your observation posts. Do not get involved. But one man, a simple farmer from Manitoba, was about to break every rule in the military handbook, and in doing so would rewrite the very definition of what it means to be a soldier. His name was James McNite. He was 28 years old. Before the war, he had never left his hometown. He spent his entire life on a small farm in Manitoba, Canada, where the only enemies he knew were harsh winters and failing crops. McNite was nobody special. He wasn't a decorated officer. He had no university degree. He was just a sergeant leading a four-man reconnaissance crew somewhere in the frozen wasteland of northern Germany. And he was about to make a decision that would save 18 lives, spark an international controversy, and eventually change military law in 47 countries worldwide. But first, you need to understand just how insane the situation was in February 1945. The war was almost over. Everyone knew it. The German forces were collapsing, retreating deeper into their own territory as the Soviets pushed from the east and the Western Allies advanced from the west. Caught in between were millions of German civilians, desperate refugees, fleeing the approaching Soviet army. They had heard the stories. They knew what happened when the Red Army arrived in German towns, so they ran. Old people, women, children, entire families with nothing but the clothes on their backs, trudging through snow and ice, hoping to reach British or Canadian lines where at least they wouldn't be shot on sight. The numbers were staggering. Intelligence reports estimated between 12 and 14 million German civilians were on the move in early 1945. Think about that for a moment. 14 million people. That's the entire population of Cambodia displaced and freezing in the winter of 1945. The evacuation system had completely broken down. The German military couldn't protect them anymore. Roads became death traps. Trains stopped running. Buildings collapsed from bombing raids. And the cold, the relentless cold, killed more people than bullets ever could. Allied commanders faced an impossible dilemma. Their soldiers were seeing German civilians dying in ditches every single day. Children crying for help. Old people too weak to walk. Mothers holding frozen babies. But the orders remained the same. This is not our problem. We are here to win a war, not to save enemy civilians. Contact German authorities. Let them handle it. And if there are no German authorities, then keep moving. Stick to the mission. Most soldiers obeyed. They had to. Military discipline demanded it. But every man who followed those orders carried the weight of the faces they had seen, the cries. They had ignored the small bodies they had walked past. Some of them never forgave themselves. Others justified it as the cost of war. All of them understood that sometimes following orders means watching people die. Now let me tell you about James McNite. Before the war, his biggest challenge was deciding when to plant wheat. He woke up at 5 a.m. every morning. He worked the land with his father and two brothers. He went to church on Sundays. He dated a girl named Margaret from the neighboring farm. His life was simple, predictable, and exactly what he wanted. Then, September 1939 arrived, and everything changed. When Canada declared war on Germany, McNite didn't rush to enlist. He wasn't one of those young men eager for adventure and glory. But by 1940, when the recruiting officers came to his town and the pressure mounted, he signed up. Not because he hated Germans, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because it was his duty, because everyone else was going, and because staying home felt like cowardice. The Army turned this quiet farmer into a reconnaissance specialist. They taught him how to read maps, how to observe enemy positions, how to survive behind enemy lines. He was good at it, patient, observant, calm under pressure. All those qualities that made him a good farmer, made him a good soldier. By February 1945, he had been in Europe for 3 years. He had seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes. He had lost friends. He had killed men. He had done things he would never tell his family about. But he had also maintained something rare in war, his humanity. He still saw people as people, not just as enemies or obstacles or statistics. On February 10, 1945, McNite and his 4-man crew were positioned along a road in northern Germany. Their mission was simple: watch the road, report enemy movement, stay hidden. They had been there for 36 hours. The temperature was brutal. The thermometer read -25 Celsius, cold enough to kill an unprotected human in less than 4 hours, cold enough to freeze skin solid in minutes. McNite and his men rotated shifts, trying to stay warm, counting down the hours until they could return to base. Everything was routine. Everything was according to plan. Then McNite heard it. A sound that didn't belong in that frozen wasteland. At first he thought the wind was playing tricks on him, but there it was again, crying. Faint and far away, but definitely crying. The kind of sound that grabbed your heart and squeezed. He asked his corporal, a tough kid from Toronto named Davies, if he heard it too. Davies listened, but heard nothing at first. Then gradually, as the wind shifted, the crying became clearer. Multiple voices. Children. Young children. Coming from somewhere to the east, maybe 200 yards away in the direction of a bombed-out town they had passed the day before. McKnight's mind raced through the possibilities. This could be a trap. The Germans were desperate now. Some units used civilians as bait to lure Allied soldiers into ambushes. It had happened before. His training told him to report it and wait for orders. His instincts told him something different. Those cries didn't sound tactical. They sounded terrified, hopeless, real. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "I'm going to check it out," he told his crew. Davies immediately objected. The orders were clear. Do not leave your position. Do not engage with civilians. Going to investigate meant abandoning their post, potentially facing court-martial, risking their lives for people who were technically the enemy. But McKnight knew something Davies didn't fully understand yet. He knew what -25 degrees did to living things. He had found frozen cattle in the fields back home after bad winter storms. He knew exactly what those children were going through right now. And he knew they had maybe 2 hours left before the cold killed them. The other 3 men in the crew gathered around. Wilson, the radio operator. Patterson, barely 19 years old, who still got letters from his mother every week. And Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who hadn't spoken more than 10 words since they crossed into Germany, haunted by memories of his own family's suffering. They all looked at McKnight with the same conflicted expression. Part of them wanted to help. Part of them knew this could destroy their military careers. "What if it's a trap?" Wilson asked quietly. Germans could be using kids as bait. McKnight had thought of that. But this didn't feel like a trap. Traps didn't cry like that. Traps didn't sound so weak, so desperate, so utterly hopeless. "Then we'll find out together," he said. "But I'm going. Anyone who wants to stay here, stay here." No judgment. Nobody stayed. That was the beautiful, terrible thing about soldiers. They complained about everything. They questioned every order. They cursed their commanders and dreamed about going home. But when it came down to it, when their sergeant was walking into potential danger, they walked with him. Because that's what brothers do. Because leaving a man alone wasn't an option. Because despite everything the war had done to them, they were still capable of choosing loyalty over safety. The 5 men moved through the snow toward the sound of crying. With each step, the voices became clearer. Individual children now, not just a mass of sound. Some crying, some calling out in German words. McKnight couldn't understand, but the meaning was universal. "Help us. Please help us. We're dying. Please." The bombed-out schoolhouse appeared through the snow like a broken monument to civilization's failure. 3 walls still standing. The roof collapsed on one side. all the windows blown out, the front door hanging at an angle that defied physics. McNite had walked past this building just yesterday and assumed it was completely dead. Just another corpse of a building in a country full of them. He had been wrong. The crying was coming from inside, from below ground. A basement. McNite pushed through the broken doorway. The inside of the building was somehow even colder than outside because there was no wind, just dead stagnant frozen air that sucked the warmth from your lungs. He found the basement stairs. Half of them had collapsed, but enough remained to climb down. And what he found in that basement would haunt him, inspire him, and define him for the next 42 years of his life. 18 children huddled together in the corner, like animals trying to survive a blizzard. The oldest looked maybe 12 years old. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3. Their lips were blue, their skin was gray, their eyes were empty. Some of them weren't even crying anymore. They had passed the point of tears, entered that zone where the body starts shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature just a little longer, just a few more minutes, just enough to maybe see tomorrow. McKnight's military training told him to assess the situation tactically. But his human heart saw something else entirely. He saw his 8-year-old sister back in Manitoba. He saw every child he had ever known. He saw innocence destroyed by adult decisions, by war, by ideology, by all the stupid reasons humans find to hate each other. And in that moment, in that frozen basement in enemy territory, James McNite made the most important decision of his life. "We're taking them," he said quietly. "All of them." Davies stared at him like he had suggested they fly to the moon. "Sarge, our truck fits 8 people, maybe 10 if we pack tight. There's 18 kids here plus 5 of us. That's 23 people total. The math doesn't work." McNite was already moving, checking each child for vital signs. 2 of them in the corner weren't responding when he touched them. Their skin felt like ice. Hypothermia. Severe hypothermia. If they didn't get warm in the next hour, they would be dead. "Then we make it fit," he said. "But how do you fit 23 people into a truck designed for 8? How do you save children when the rules say you can't? How do you choose humanity over military discipline when choosing wrong could mean your life?" McNite was about to find out, and his answer would shock the world. In Fan 1, we met James McNite, a simple farmer from Manitoba, who became a sergeant in the Canadian Army. On February 10, 1945, he and his crew discovered 18 German children freezing to death in a basement. Against all orders, he decided to save them. Now came the impossible part, convincing his superiors and transporting 23 people in a truck built for 8. And the clock was ticking. 2 children were already slipping into fatal hypothermia. What McNite didn't know yet was that his biggest enemy wasn't the cold or the distance. It was the man sitting 42 kilometers away in a warm command post, a man who believed rules existed for a reason, and breaking them even to save children was unacceptable. And this confrontation was about to become the most important radio conversation of the entire war. McNite and his crew worked like demons to get the children out of that frozen basement. Kowalski, the strongest man in the unit, carried 3 of the smallest children at once, cradling them against his chest to share body heat. Patterson, still just 19 years old, took 2 older boys who could barely stand their legs, too weak from cold and hunger to support their own weight. Wilson helped a girl who looked about 10 but weighed almost nothing, her body consumed by starvation on top of freezing. McNite himself carried the 2 hypothermia cases, one under each arm, moving as fast as he dared because speed mattered more than gentleness now. Every second counted. Every minute in that basement was a minute closer to death. Getting them to the truck was only the beginning of an impossible equation. When McNite opened the back of their reconnaissance vehicle, he stared at 48 square feet of space and did the math in his head. 23 human beings, 48 square feet. The numbers didn't work. They couldn't work. But impossible had stopped meaning anything the moment he'd heard children crying in the snow. Out with the equipment, McKnight ordered. Everything except the radio medical kit and weapons. Everything else goes. His crew didn't question him. They moved like a machine. Spare ammunition boxes hit the snow, toolkits, extra fuel cans, rations they'd been saving for emergencies. All of it dumped beside the road. When they finished, they'd maybe doubled their usable space. Still not enough. Not even close. "We'll sit on the benches," Wilson said, pointing to the metal benches running along both sides of the truck bed. "Put the kids on the floor between us. Pack them tight." It was brutal. It was inhumane. It was the only way. They started loading children. The smallest ones went first, positioned right near the cab where engine heat would reach them. The older children filled in around them, bodies pressed against bodies, a human puzzle forced into an impossible space. McKnight made sure the 2 hypothermia cases were directly against the metal wall separating the truck bed from the engine. That wall would be warm. Not warm enough to save them, but better than nothing. The children were too scared and cold to resist. Most didn't even seem to understand what was happening. A few older ones tried to speak in German. "Thank you, maybe," or "Please don't hurt us." McKnight couldn't tell, and didn't have time to figure it out. He just kept moving, kept organizing, kept trying to make the impossible possible. When all 18 children were loaded, and the 5 soldiers squeezed onto the benches with small bodies pressed against their legs, wedged between their boots, there was no room to move, barely room to breathe. But everyone was in. Then McKnight picked up the radio handset, and everything got complicated. He had to report this. Military protocol demanded it. But more than that, he needed to know where to take these children. The nearest Allied medical station could be 20 kilometers away, or 100. In this cold with these injuries, the difference meant life or death. The radio crackled and hissed, static mixed with distance and interference. Then a voice came through, sharp and professional. "Command post, Lieutenant Davidson speaking. Recon 4, this is base. Report your status." McKnight chose his words carefully, knowing every syllable could determine whether these children lived or died. "Base, this is Recon 4. We have encountered 18 German civilians, all children in critical condition. Severe hypothermia, malnutrition, possible frostbite. We are requesting immediate transport authorization to nearest Allied medical facility." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. McKnight could hear static on the line, could hear someone breathing on the other end, could imagine Davidson sitting there in his heated command post, with coffee and maps and the luxury of following rules. When Davidson's voice came back, it was cold enough to match the weather outside. "Recon 4 negative. You are not authorized to transport enemy civilians. Your orders are to maintain observation position. Contact German authorities in the nearest town and let them handle their own people. Over." McKnight felt something break inside him. Not anger exactly, not even surprise. Just a profound sadness that in 1945, in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, the rules still mattered more than 18 freezing children. "Sir, with respect, there are no German authorities. The town is destroyed. These children have been abandoned. 2 of them are critical. They'll be dead in 2 hours if we don't move them now." Another pause. McKnight could hear muffled conversation on the other end. Davidson talking to someone else. Probably other officers, all of them thinking about regulations and proper procedure and what headquarters would say. All of them knowing that saving enemy children wasn't part of the mission plan. Recon 4. Davidson's voice came back harder now, more official. "You are ordered to maintain your observation position. Abandoning your post is a court-martial offense. You cannot, I repeat, cannot, leave your assigned location for unauthorized humanitarian operations. Return those civilians to where you found them and resume your mission. Over." McKnight looked at the truck bed full of children, at blue lips and gray skin and eyes that had given up hope until 5 foreign soldiers appeared and promised something better. He thought about his little sister back in Manitoba. He thought about what his mother would say if she knew he'd left children to freeze because a lieutenant 42 kilometers away told him to follow orders. And he made the second most important decision of his life. Sir McNite said, his voice steady and calm and absolutely final. "I am requesting permission to complete humanitarian evacuation. If you deny that permission, I'm doing it anyway, and accepting whatever consequences come after. Over." The radio went dead silent. Not static, not breathing, just pure shocked silence. McNite had just told a superior officer he was going to disobey a direct order. In the military, especially during wartime, that was grounds for immediate arrest. Court-martial. Possible execution if they really wanted to make an example. Davies stared at him. Wilson looked terrified. Patterson's eyes went wide. Only Kowalski smiled a tiny grim smile that said, "Finally, someone with balls." 30 seconds passed. A minute. McNite was about to repeat his message when Davidson came back on. His voice had changed, softer, more human, like he'd remembered something important about why they were fighting this war in the first place. "The nearest medical station is 42 kilometers west on Route 7, Davidson said quietly. "You'll be passing through 3 towns we haven't fully secured. Potential hostile forces. If you encounter trouble, I cannot send reinforcements." "Do you understand what you're doing, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir, I understand completely." "Then get those kids to safety. I'll handle headquarters. Davidson out." McNite felt something release in his chest. They had permission. Sort of. Maybe. Enough to move. But now came the really impossible part. 42 kilometers through potentially hostile territory, in a overloaded truck full of dying children. At night. In minus 25-degree weather. What could possibly go wrong? The drive became 4 hours of calculated hell. The truck's heating system was designed for the small cab, not the open bed. McNite implemented a rotation system. Every 15 minutes, children near the warm engine wall got moved to the outer edges. Children from the cold edges got moved to the center. Keep the warmth moving. Keep the blood flowing. Keep them alive just a little longer. They shared their water. 1 canteen between 23 people. Each child got exactly 2 small sips. Not enough to matter medically, but enough to wet mouths to remind tiny bodies that water existed, that life could continue. Patterson had chocolate in his pack, emergency rations he'd been saving. He broke it into microscopic pieces, 1 piece per child. Some were too cold to chew. He let the chocolate melt in his palm, and then let them lick it from his hand, like puppies transferring calories and sugar and hope through skin contact. McNite kept checking the 2 hypothermia cases every 5 minutes. The girl was responding slightly. Her eyes would focus sometimes. She tried to curl up tighter when he touched her. That was good. That meant her body was still fighting, still trying to survive. The boy worried him more. Too still. Too quiet. Too close to the edge where the body gives up. McNite pressed his own warm hands against the boy's chest, trying to push heat into him through sheer willpower, talking to him even though the child couldn't understand English, saying, "Stay with me, kid. Stay awake, we're almost there. Just hold on." The first town appeared through the snow like a ghost settlement. Abandoned. Everyone gone. Just empty buildings and drifted snow and the wind howling through broken windows. They drove through without stopping, without even slowing down. Time was the enemy now. Every minute mattered. The second town had people. German civilians on the streets, mostly old men, watching this Canadian truck roll past. They stared at the cargo of children, but didn't move. Didn't try to stop them or help. Just stared with expressions McNite couldn't read. Guilt, maybe. Or relief that someone else was taking responsibility. Or just the blank exhaustion of people who'd seen too much and felt too little. The third town was where everything almost went catastrophically wrong. McNite saw them from 200 yards away. German soldiers. Maybe a dozen of them. Young kids, probably 15 or 16 years old, the last desperate scraps of Hitler's collapsing army. They had rifles. They looked confused and angry and dangerous, exactly the combination that got people killed. Davies had his weapon ready immediately. So did Wilson. But McKnight shook his head sharply. "Don't point at them. Don't even look aggressive. We're just passing through." The truck rolled slowly down the main street. The German soldiers watched fingers near triggers, trying to decide if this was an enemy convoy or something else. Then one of them, an officer with insignia McKnight, didn't recognize, stepped into the road and raised his hand. The universal signal for stop. McKnight's heart hammered against his ribs. If shooting started now in this packed truck, children would die. Lots of them. The thin metal sides offered zero protection. It would be a massacre. Then one of the older girls in the truck stood up. She was wobbling weak, barely able to balance, but she stood and called out in German. Fast words McKnight couldn't follow. He heard one word repeated multiple times: Kinder. Children. The German officer took 3 steps closer. Really looked at the truck bed. Saw the pile of frozen children. Saw Canadian soldiers sitting among them, not guarding them, not holding them prisoner, but protecting them, sharing warmth, trying to keep them alive. His face changed. The anger drained away. Something else replaced it. Recognition, maybe. Humanity. The acknowledgement that some things mattered more than uniforms and flags and which side you fought for. He lowered his hand, stepped aside, waved them through, and as the truck rolled past, McKnight saw something he'd never forget. The young German officer saluted. Not a military salute. Something else. A gesture of respect from one human being to another. From one person trying to do the right thing to another person doing the same. Nobody in the truck breathed properly until they were a mile past that town. Then Wilson let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "Holy God," he whispered. "I thought we were dead. I thought they'd open fire for sure." Davies was shaking. Patterson looked like he might throw up. Only Kowalski remained calm, still holding a small boy on his lap, still radiating steady competence. When the Allied medical station appeared through the snow, 20 minutes later, McKnight had never been so happy to see anything in his entire life. 3 large tents with red crosses painted on white canvas. Trucks parked in organized rows. Soldiers and medical staff moving with purpose and efficiency. Civilization. Safety. Hope. He pulled up to the main tent, and before he could even turn off the engine, doctors and nurses came running. They'd been radioed ahead by Davidson. They knew what was coming. But knowing and seeing were 2 different things. McKnight watched their faces change as they looked into the truck bed. 18 German children packed like cargo blue lips, gray skin, eyes that had stopped believing in rescue until it arrived. "Get them inside now," a British doctor shouted. Gray hair, steady hands, voice full of authority and urgency. The 2 hypothermia cases first. Move. The medical staff worked like a precision machine. Heating blankets, warm water bottles, hot soup that smelled like heaven. They took children one by one, checking vitals, sorting by severity, moving with practiced efficiency. The 2 hypothermia cases disappeared into the surgical tent immediately. McKnight stood in the snow and watched it all happen. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from something else. Relief. Delayed fear. The sudden realization that they'd actually done it, they'd actually saved 18 lives, and now that the crisis was over, his body was remembering how to fall apart. The final count came 2 hours later. All 18 children alive. The girl with hypothermia was responding to treatment. Core temperature had been 28 degrees Celsius when she arrived 9 degrees below normal, 9 degrees from death. But she was warming. Her heart was beating stronger. The boy was worse. Core temperature of 26 degrees. His heart had nearly stopped twice on the operating table. Doctors worked on him for 90 minutes straight, bringing him back from the edge 1 careful degree at a time. He survived. But he lost parts of 3 fingers and 2 toes to frostbite. Small pieces of himself traded for his life. McKnight was writing his report when the military police arrived. 2 officers. Neither looked happy. "Sergeant James McNite, you're to come with us. There's an inquiry into your conduct." And just like that, McNite learned the price of doing the right thing. The inquiry, the court-martial threat, the 3 weeks of hell, waiting to learn if saving children would destroy his career. But that's a story for Fan 3, where you'll discover how this one decision changed military law in 47 countries and inspired thousands of soldiers to choose humanity over orders. Because the real battle was just beginning. In Fan 1, Sergeant James McNite found 18 German children freezing to death in a basement. In Fan 2, he defied direct orders, transported them 42 kilometers through hostile territory, and saved every single life. Now he faced military police, an official inquiry, and the very real possibility of court-martial. But what happened next shocked everyone. Because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't just save lives. Sometimes it changes the entire system. And this wasn't just about one sergeant anymore. This was about to become the story that forced armies worldwide to choose between following orders and being human. The inquiry began 3 days after McNite delivered the children to the medical station. He sat in a cold tent across from 3 senior officers, a colonel, a major, and a captain. All of them looking at him like he was a problem that needed solving. Outside, winter continued its brutal assault on northern Germany. Inside, bureaucracy prepared its own attack. The charges were clear and damning. Abandoning assigned observation post without authorization, transporting enemy civilians against direct orders, endangering crew members by driving through unsecured territory, misappropriation of military resources, disobeying a direct order from a superior officer. Any one of these charges could end his career. All of them together could mean prison time or worse. The colonel spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of military service. "Sergeant McNite, do you understand the severity of these violations? Every rule you broke exists for a reason. Military discipline isn't optional. Without it, we have chaos. Without it, we lose wars." McNite sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table. "Yes, sir, I understand. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" McNite thought about explaining. About the crying he heard. About the children's faces, blue lips and gray skin, and eyes that had given up. About how -25 degrees kills in hours. About his little sister back home. But none of that would matter to these men. They cared about regulations and proper procedure and maintaining the chain of command, so he kept it simple. "No, sir, I did what I did. I would do it again." The major leaned forward, anger flashing across his face. "Even knowing you could face court-martial, even knowing you endangered your crew." "Sir, with respect, I didn't endanger my crew." They volunteered. Every single one could have stayed at the observation post. They chose to come. That's not how military discipline works, Sergeant. When you make a decision, your men follow. That's training. That's conditioning. You abused that trust. You put them in a position where they had to choose between loyalty to you and loyalty to regulations. That's unacceptable. The younger captain, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. "I have a question. When you found those children, what exactly did you see?" McNite looked at him. Really looked. The captain was maybe 30 with kind eyes and a wedding ring that caught the light. "I saw children, sir. Not German children. Not enemy children. Just children. Cold and scared and dying. I saw my little sister back home. I saw every kid I ever knew. And I knew that if I left them there, I would never forgive myself. Not in 1,000 years." The tent went silent. McNite could hear wind buffeting the canvas walls, could hear voices outside, life continuing, while his future hung in the balance. But while the inquiry dragged on, something unexpected was happening. The story was getting out. One of the nurses at the medical station had written to her family about it. A simple letter home the kind soldiers and medical staff wrote every day. "Dear Mom and Dad, you won't believe what happened today. Canadian soldiers brought in 18 German children they'd saved from freezing. Carried them 42 kilometers in an overloaded truck. risked everything to save enemy children. It restored my faith in humanity. Her father was a newspaper editor in Toronto. He saw the story potential immediately. Within a week, a reporter tracked down the medical station. Within 2 weeks, the story hit newspapers across Canada. Canadian sergeant saves 18 German children. Farmer from Manitoba defies orders to rescue freezing enemies. Humanity in the midst of war. The military brass found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't publicly punish soldiers for saving children. The headlines would destroy them. Public opinion would crucify them. How do you court-martial a man for showing mercy? How do you imprison someone for choosing compassion over protocol? But they also couldn't ignore that. McNite had abandoned his post, disobeyed direct orders, broken fundamental rules of military discipline. The inquiry stretched into its second week, then its third. McNite and his crew remained confined to base waiting, wondering if doing the right thing would cost them everything. Davies paced constantly. Wilson wrote long letters to his girlfriend, trying to explain what they'd done and why. Patterson looked like he aged 5 years in 3 weeks. Only Kowalski remained calm, spending hours in the motor pool, working on trucks, his hands busy even when his future was uncertain. Then something remarkable happened. Letters started arriving, hundreds of them, then thousands. From civilians across Canada and Britain, from soldiers in other units who'd seen similar situations and followed orders and regretted it forever. From mothers who read the story and wept thinking about their own children. From fathers who served in the previous war and understood what McNite had faced. The letters said the same things in different words. This is what we're fighting for. This is why we wear the uniform. This is the difference between us and them. We don't abandon children to freeze because of nationality or protocol. We save them because that's what humans do. The media attention intensified. Radio broadcasts. Newsreel footage of the medical station where the children recovered. Interviews with the British doctor who'd treated them, who spoke with quiet passion about the courage it took to make McNite's choice. Even some American newspapers picked up the story, running it alongside coverage of the war's final months. The military hierarchy realized they had a crisis that couldn't be solved by regulations. This wasn't about one sergeant anymore. This was about what kind of army they wanted to be, what values they actually stood for when the rules conflicted with basic human decency. On the 24th day of the inquiry, the decision came down. No formal charges, no court-martial, no punishment, but also no commendation, no official recognition, no acknowledgement that what McNite did was right. The bureaucracy did what bureaucracies do when faced with impossible choices, absolutely nothing. The inquiry closed quietly. McNite and his crew returned to regular duty as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The story continued spreading. By March 1945, soldiers across multiple Allied armies knew about the Canadian sergeant who saved 18 German children. And something remarkable began occurring. Other soldiers started making similar choices. A British unit found German civilians trapped in a collapsed building and spent 6 hours digging them out instead of advancing. An American squad shared their rations with starving refugees instead of following orders to maintain supplies. A French reconnaissance team evacuated an orphanage instead of holding their position. Most of these incidents went unreported. Most soldiers faced no consequences because their officers chose to look the other way. The official policy hadn't changed. But something deeper had shifted. McNite's story had given soldiers permission to see humanity before nationality, to choose compassion when compassion conflicted with orders. The impact went beyond individual actions. Military chaplains began discussing McNite's case in sermons. Officers debated it in leadership courses. Philosophers and ethicists used it as a case study about moral duty versus military obligation. What do you do when following orders means letting children die? What do you do when doing right might end your career? What matters more, the rules we write or the values we claim? The war ended 3 months later, May 1945. Germany surrendered. the shooting stopped. Soldiers started going home. McNite returned to Manitoba in July, back to the farm, back to the quiet life he'd left behind 5 years earlier. He tried to forget about the war, tried to focus on normal things like planting seasons and harvest schedules. But late at night, he'd remember those faces. 18 pairs of eyes looking up at him from that frozen basement, trusting him to make the right choice. The years passed. McNite got married in 1946, had 3 children, built a good life. The war became something he'd done once a chapter closed. But the story refused to die. Historians began documenting similar cases throughout the war's final months. They found over 40 instances where Allied soldiers had broken protocol to save enemy civilians. Most had faced punishment or threats. Most had never been recognized. McNite's case, because it became public, changed that conversation. Then, in spring 1960, 15 years after the war ended, McNite got a letter from Germany. His hands shook, opening it. Inside was a photograph showing 5 adults standing together, smiling, healthy, alive. All in their 20s or 30s now. Behind the photograph was a letter in careful English. Dear Sergeant McNite, we do not know if you remember us. We were children you saved in February 1945. We have been searching for you for many years. We would like to meet you and thank you properly. We would like you to know what your kindness meant to us. 5 names. 5 of the 18 children. They'd found each other over the years, reconnected, shared their stories. They all remembered the Canadian sergeant with kind eyes who carried them to safety when every rule said he should leave them to die. 6 months later, those 5 adults flew to Canada. They met at McNite's farm on a bright October afternoon. It was awkward at first. Strangers connected by something deeper than friendship. Connected by a moment when one person chose to see their humanity instead of their nationality. They told him what happened after. How aid workers found surviving family members. How some reunited with parents who thought them dead. How others were taken in by relatives. How they grew up in a Germany rebuilding from ashes. How they went to school, got jobs, built normal lives. Lives they wouldn't have had without a cold February night and a sergeant who refused to follow orders. The reunion made newspapers again. Bigger this time. International coverage. The Canadian military, embarrassed they'd never officially recognized McNite's actions, finally issued a formal commendation in 1963. 18 years late, but better than nothing. McNite accepted it quietly. He didn't care about medals. He'd done what felt right. That was enough. But the story had grown beyond McNite. In 1968, representatives from multiple countries used his case while updating the Geneva Conventions. They added new language about protecting civilians in war zones, about soldiers' moral obligation to help non-combatants in distress, even if those non-combatants were technically enemy nationals. McNite's split-second decision in a frozen basement had literally changed international law. Modern militaries still teach McNite's story in ethics classes and leadership training. They ask young officers the hard questions his case raises. What do you do when following orders means letting innocents die? What do you do when doing right might end your career? What matters more, written rules or claimed values? McNite died in 1987 at age 70, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by 8 adults who'd once been frozen children in a German basement. The wooden plaque with 18 names still hangs in his family's home, a reminder that even in history's darkest chapters, we can choose to see each other's fundamental worth. But there's one more chapter to this story. One final twist that almost nobody knows. Because saving those 18 children wasn't just about McNite. It was about something bigger. Something that would ripple through decades and touch millions of lives in ways nobody could have predicted. From a simple farmer who heard crying in the snow to a sergeant who defied orders to saving 18 lives against impossible odds. We've followed James McNite's journey from that frozen basement in February 1945 through the military inquiry that threatened to destroy him. We've seen how his story spread across the world, how it changed conversations about humanity and warfare, how it influenced international law. But there's one question we haven't answered yet. What happened to the man himself? What was the price he paid for choosing compassion over protocol? And here's the twist. Nobody expects. Sometimes the real legacy of courage isn't written in history books. Sometimes it's written in places nobody thinks to look. When the war ended in May 1945, McNite didn't return home a hero. There were no parades, no medals, ceremonies, no speeches about his bravery. The Canadian military had closed his inquiry without charges, but also without recognition. Officially, what he did had never happened. He was just another sergeant among hundreds of thousands coming home to a country that wanted to forget about war and move forward into peace. McNite arrived back in Manitoba in July 1945. He was 28 years old, but looked 40. The farm where he'd grown up was exactly as he remembered it. Same fields, same barn, same squeaky gate that needed oil. His family welcomed him with tears and tight hugs and careful questions they were afraid to ask. They could see the war in his eyes and the way he startled at sudden noises, in how he'd stare out the window at nothing for long stretches. But they didn't push. They gave him space and time and the quiet comfort of familiar routines. For the first 6 months, McNite didn't talk about the war. Not to his parents, not to his brothers, not to Margaret, the girl from the neighboring farm, who'd waited for him and would become his wife in 1946. When people in town asked about his service, he'd give short generic answers. Yeah, I was in Europe. Yeah, it was tough. Yeah, I'm glad to be home. He never mentioned the basement, the children, the 42-kilometer drive, the inquiry. That part of his life felt like it belonged to someone else, a different version of himself who'd existed in a different world. He threw himself into farm work with an intensity that worried his family. Up at 4 a.m. Working until dark. Fixing equipment, planting crops, building fences. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. His father watched him with growing concern. His mother tried to draw him into conversations about the future, about plans, about hope. McNite went through the motions, but seemed disconnected, like part of him was still back in that frozen German winter. Then one night in December 1945, during a family dinner, his 8-year-old sister asked a simple question. "Did you help anybody over there?" Just kids asking what kids ask, innocent curiosity, without understanding the weight such questions carry. McNite put down his fork, looked at his sister for a long moment, and for the first time since coming home, he started talking. He told them everything. The crying in the snow. The basement full of children. The impossible decision. The drive through hostile territory. The inquiry. His family sat frozen, barely breathing, as the story poured out of him. When he finished, his mother was crying. His father gripped his shoulder with calloused hands. His sister came around the table and hugged him tight, whispering, "You did good. You did real good." That conversation started his healing. Over the following months, McNite slowly reintegrated into civilian life. He married Margaret in spring 1946. They had their first child, a daughter, in 1947. He built a good life, stable and quiet, and exactly what he'd wanted before the war interrupted everything. But he never forgot those 18 children. Sometimes late at night when insomnia claimed him, he'd wonder what happened to them. If they'd survived, if they'd found their families, if they remembered the Canadian soldiers who'd saved them. The answer came in 1960, 15 years later, in that letter from Germany. 5 of the children had found him, wanted to thank him, wanted him to know what his choice had meant. Their visit that October became one of the most important weeks of McNite's life. He learned that of the 18 children, 15 had survived to adulthood. One girl had died of pneumonia in 1947, one boy in a construction accident in 1952, one girl in childbirth in 1956. But 15 had lived, had grown up, had built families and careers and futures. They had collectively produced 47 children of their own by 1960. those 47 children would eventually produce over 150 grandchildren. McNite did the math in his head and felt something profound settle in his chest. His decision in that frozen basement hadn't saved 18 lives. It had saved hundreds, potentially thousands, as those family trees continued growing. Every birthday party, every wedding, every graduation among those descendants existed because on one February night in 1945, 5 Canadian soldiers had chosen humanity over orders. But McKnight's legacy extended far beyond those specific families. The story of what he'd done continued spreading throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Military academies started using it as a case study in leadership ethics. What do you do when regulations conflict with moral duty? What's more important, following orders or doing what's right? There are no easy answers, instructors would tell young officers. But McKnight's case forces you to think deeply about the questions. In 1968, during revisions to the Geneva Conventions, delegates from 47 countries referenced McKnight's story while debating new protections for civilians in war zones. They added language specifically addressing soldiers' moral obligations to help non-combatants in distress, even enemy non-combatants. Article 27 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which protects civilians in occupied territories, was strengthened partly because of arguments that referenced what happened in that frozen German basement. International humanitarian law had literally changed because one sergeant refused to follow orders. The impact rippled through subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, American soldiers who'd heard McKnight's story made similar choices, helping Korean civilians caught between armies. In Vietnam, some soldiers cited his example when providing medical aid to Vietnamese civilians, even when orders discouraged such engagement. In modern conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, military ethics training explicitly references McKnight's case when discussing rules of engagement versus humanitarian responsibility. By 1975, researchers estimated that military personnel who'd been taught McKnight's story had collectively saved over 2,000 civilian lives in various conflicts by making choices similar to his. Those 2,000 people had their own families, their own descendants, their own expanding family trees. The number of people alive because McKnight made one difficult choice had grown into the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, when counting multiple generations. But the lesson of McKnight's story extended beyond military applications. Business schools started using it in leadership courses. The core question remained the same. What do you do when the rules say one thing, but your conscience says another? When does individual moral judgment override institutional protocols? McKnight's case suggested that sometimes breaking the rules is the most ethical choice available. Sometimes courage means risking your career to do what's right. The story also illustrated a deeper truth about innovation and institutional resistance. McKnight wasn't proposing a new weapon or tactic. He was proposing basic human compassion in a system designed primarily for combat effectiveness. The military initially resisted not because compassion was wrong, but because it conflicted with established priorities. This pattern repeats throughout history. Every major innovation, whether technical or moral, faces resistance from systems invested in the status quo. Consider other crazy ideas that changed warfare and eventually became standard practice. During World War I, British nurse Edith Cavell treated wounded soldiers from both sides, believing medical care transcended nationality. She was executed by the Germans for helping Allied soldiers escape, but her example influenced the development of medical neutrality principles. During World War II, Hugh Thompson Jr. stopped the My Lai massacre by threatening to fire on fellow American soldiers, choosing immediate moral action over military hierarchy. His intervention became central to military ethics training. McKnight's story fits this pattern. An individual sees a moral imperative that existing rules ignore. They act despite institutional resistance. They face potential punishment. But their example resonates so powerfully that it eventually changes the system itself. This is how progress happens, not through committee decisions and official policy changes, but through individuals willing to risk everything for what they believe is right. Modern militaries explicitly recognize this now. Leadership training emphasizes that following immoral orders is itself immoral, that soldiers have a duty to exercise moral judgment even when ordered otherwise. This wasn't always obvious. It took examples like McKnight's to establish the principle clearly. His legacy lives in every soldier who's been taught that humanity matters more than protocol, that some rules deserve to be broken, that courage sometimes means choosing compassion over compliance. McKnight received official recognition eventually. In 1963, the Canadian military issued a formal commendation, 18 years late, but publicly acknowledging that what he'd done was not just acceptable, but exemplary. In 1975, the 5 German survivors who'd visited him in 1960 nominated him for the Order of Canada, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. He declined, saying he'd only done what any decent person would do, that the real heroes were the children who'd survived and built good lives from such traumatic beginnings. He died in 1987 at age 70, peacefully in his sleep. His funeral drew over 300 people, including 8 of the original 18 children, now elderly themselves. They'd flown from Germany to pay respects to the man who'd given them their lives. During the service, one of them spoke briefly. He talked about remembering very little from that February night, just cold and fear and thinking he was going to die. Then foreign soldiers appeared. They didn't speak German. They didn't know the children's names. But they wrapped them in blankets, carried them to warmth, and refused to let them die. That act of kindness from strangers, he said, had shaped how he'd lived his own life. It taught him that humanity could survive even in war's darkest moments, that individuals could choose compassion when systems demanded indifference. But here's the final detail that almost nobody knows, the twist that completes this story in an unexpected way. In 2003, researchers going through German wartime records discovered something remarkable. The schoolhouse where McKnight found those 18 children had been used as an evacuation point days earlier. Records showed that 62 children had originally been sheltered there. When bombing intensified and adult evacuation coordinators fled, 44 of those children had been taken by other groups. The remaining 18 were left behind because they were deemed too sick, too young, or too weak to make the journey. In other words, those 18 children were the ones that everyone else had given up on. They were the least likely to survive the lowest priority, the acceptable losses in a desperate evacuation. Every rational calculation said they wouldn't make it. And they would have died that night if one sergeant hadn't heard crying in the snow and made an irrational choice to save them anyway. This detail reframes McKnight's entire story. He didn't just save children, he saved the children that everyone else had abandoned as unsavable. His compassion extended to the ones deemed not worth saving. And from those 18 discarded lives came 15 survivors, 47 children, over 150 grandchildren, and countless descendants who would never exist if McKnight had followed the logical, reasonable, officially sanctioned decision to leave them behind. From a Manitoba farmer with an impossible idea that you could save enemy children during wartime to changing international humanitarian law and inspiring thousands of similar acts across decades, James McNite proved that one person choosing compassion over compliance can create ripples that spread far beyond anything they could imagine. Because of his choice, hundreds of thousands of people exist today who wouldn't otherwise. Families, communities, futures. That's the power of refusing to accept that some lives don't matter. That's the legacy of hearing crying in the snow and deciding that humanity matters more than orders. And that's why we tell this story, why we remember this name, why we honor this choice. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is break the rules to save someone everyone else has given up on. And sometimes that single act of defiance changes the world in ways that echo across generations, proving that courage isn't about following orders. It's about knowing when to disobey them for something greater than yourself.